Hello and welcome to this lecture on decision making. Managers are paid to make decisions. Some decisions are tougher than others. Some are programmed and some are non-programmed. Programmed decisions have a sort of mechanical if-then nature to them. The big bucks are paid for non-programmed decisions which have no set way of being made. They are unique or unusual and infrequent. Effective decision making can be the hallmark of a successful life and career. What are we in the end but the sum of all of our decisions? So let's get started. It would be a perfect world indeed if we could always make perfectly rational decisions. If we could do that, we'd try and abide by the rational choice decision process, which is a paradigm that suggests that in decision making, people should, and typically do, use logic and all available information to choose the alternative with the highest value. Of course, we're not all like Spock from Star Trek, but if we were, we'd follow these steps. The first step is the most time-consuming and most important, and it involves the determination of whether we have a problem or an opportunity. A problem is a difference between current and desired situation. An opportunity is any deviation between current expectations and potentially better situations. The most optimistic of us would like to portray all problems as opportunities, but sometimes problems are just problems. Next, we have to choose a decision-making process. Should we make the decision ourselves? Should we let others give their input? Should we let others vote? Should we use tarot cards or a Ouija board? Then we have to develop a list of choices from which we will choose. This is not as easy as one might think, so this is a very important step. Then we make the choice. The best choice maximizes the subjective expected utility, that is, the probability of satisfaction. Be aware that sometimes the choice that satisfies us is not the same as the one that satisfies the other stakeholders. Managers are hired to make, again, non-programmed decisions, not decisions for which a policy is in place or that an employee handbook can answer. Non-programmed decisions definitely require all of the steps in the rational decision-making model. Programmed decisions, on the other hand, have been resolved in the past, so the best solution has already been identified and documented. Then we implement the choice and hope for the best. Lastly, we evaluate our decision in a sort of a feedback loop. Let's move on. Although perfectly logical, rational decisions are the goal, most of the time we encounter challenges in implementing the rational process. That is, sometimes things get in the way. Some of these include the following. Perceptual defense can get in the way of seeing and identifying problems. This involves consciously blocking out bad news as a coping mechanism, refusing to see anything that threatens our self-esteem. This is done consciously. We know we are blocking out bad news, and we do it so that it does not harm our self-esteem and self-concept. For example, back in the 1980s, Ricki Lake had a television talk show. Her favorite expression seems to have been talk to the hand, where she would stick out her hand in an effort to stop someone from telling her bad news. Another example is the American Idol phenomenon, where a contestant goes on stage, performs horribly, exits the performance room and meets their mother, and their mother says, "Those judges are wrong. Do not listen to them. You are the best singer ever born." That would be perceptual defense. Mental models are a roadmap to a solution. If a problem or an issue does not fit the existing model, then the problem is inconsequential. For example, if sales go down, some business people will increase prices to offset revenue loss. But this often results in further revenue declines. So the mental model is to increase income, you increase prices. That does not always work. Another mental model is in reference to Apple Computer's 1984 TV ad. This was not a typical TV ad and almost didn't air since it was too out of the norm. It played once on TV, but it is a classic. Look it up on YouTube if you get a chance. Decisive leadership is a problem. This is zeroing in on a solution without analyzing all the facts in order to appear decisive. For example, President Schwarzenegger in the Simpsons movie was faced with 5 unthinkable solutions. He chose number 3 without even looking at the options. When asked if he would like to read the options first, he says, "I was elected to lead, not to..." Sorry for the impression. Another identification challenge is solution-focused problems. That is, defining problems in terms of one's own pet solutions. The old adage is, to someone with a hammer, everything looks like a nail. The hammer is the solution, and they go everywhere trying to use that hammer on every problem. So everything looks like a nail. Another example is, suppose a company says the problem is that we need to increase penalties for tardy employees. That is the solution to every problem they have. Tardy employees are unproductive employees. Unproductive employees do not contribute to the bottom line. Therefore, tardy employees must be penalized. It goes on and on and on. They want to penalize tardy employees, and they will find a problem for which that solution is the answer. Another example is stakeholder framing. Those with vested interest try to frame the situation as inconsequential or as a point to a very specific problem or situation. For example, many environmental activists will point to the situation of every problem being based upon the environment. For them, everything is about the environment, and they're environmental advocates. They frame and view everything through the lens of environmental activism, even if it's really not. Let's move on. Because many times things get in the way of purely rational decision making, we often take some shortcuts. Sometimes the shortcuts are designed to counteract the challenges that we face in decision making, and sometimes the shortcuts are just because we're constrained by things outside of our control. These shortcuts are referred to as heuristics, which are simply rules of thumb or decision shortcuts. The anchoring and adjustment heuristic suggests that we are easily influenced by an initial anchor point and that we rarely move far from it. For example, in salary negotiations, the starting offer sets the initial parameter, and from that anchor, we rarely adjust or move very much. To set that anchor yourself, ask for more than you think they will give you, and then the negotiations will vacillate around that amount. The availability heuristic suggests that objects assign higher priority if they are easier to recall. In essence, we tell ourselves that we remember a similar situation in the past, and this problem is like that problem, and here's how that problem was solved. So, abracadabra, we should use the same solution that we used in the example that just sprang to mind. The problem is that emotions influence our recollection. Emotions also deviate from the purely rational decision-making process unless you are like Spock from Star Trek. Think about some of your strongest memories. It's a good bet that they are strongly tied to strong emotional experiences. Weddings, graduations, and sadly, funerals tend to stay in our memory because of the sheer joy and sometimes the total heartache of the experience. These experiences may not have been decision-making exercises, but it does show that emotions influence our recall, and the availability heuristic depends heavily upon recall. The representativeness heuristic suggests that the probability of an event occurring is higher if it is similar to another event. For example, gamblers tend to believe in hot streaks. They believe that since their bets have been winning, then their next bet will win also. Sometimes businesses like gambling. In gambling, consecutive rolls of the dice are unrelated to each other. Be careful about gambling with company resources. Another decision-making shortcut category is satisficing, which is sacrificing the perfect solution because of the need to satisfy some decision. Sometimes we choose the first solution that is good enough, like in hiring. Because our decision-making faces constraints like time and money, sometimes we need to fill a position right away. And it would be great if we could conduct a national search over 6 months for the next cashier, but sometimes we satisfy us and say, this person is good enough. Bounded rationality is the mental processing of limited and imperfect information that leads to suboptimal choice. In sum, we make suboptimal decisions because of bounded rationality. That is, there are boundaries to human beings' rational decision-making processes, some of which we know about and others of which we don't know about. Let's move on. One of the problems with decisions is that some are bad and we just cannot abandon them for one reason or another. Sometimes we cannot abandon decisions or courses of action because of pride. Sometimes because we are incapable of seeing problems with the decision. Sometimes it's because we've already blown a ton of money on it and can't detour now. And other times it's because of natural human tendencies that we all share. Here's some examples of escalation of commitment. Self-justification is maintaining a course of action in order to justify a decision. The prototypical example is when someone says, see, I told you the project would be finished. It doesn't matter that it came in at 3,000% of budgeted expenses. It is finished. I told you it could be finished, and that's all that matters. Another one is perceptual blinders. This is an unconscious screening out of negative information, as opposed to perceptual defense, which is a conscious blocking of negative information. In the unconscious screening out of negative information, for example, we might have a horrible annual performance review. The only thing we remember from that review is that the boss liked our shoes. We didn't hear any other news. We unconsciously screened it out using perceptual blinders. Closing costs are another escalation of commitment cause. These occur when you persist with the project because the cost of failure or termination are simply too high. That is, the sunk costs are too expensive. For example, a bridge spanning a waterway that begins construction on both sides but runs out of money before meeting in the middle must have more money thrown at it because a half-finished bridge is worthless. The prospect theory effect is when people dislike losing a particular amount of money more than they like winning the same amount. For example, how many students would accept an offer of losing 50 points on a quiz that must count towards their grade, losing 50 points with a coin flip if it lands on heads, or winning 50 points on that quiz if it lands on tails? The amounts you win and lose are the same, but we dislike the possibility of losing 50 points on a quiz so much that we are unlikely to actually take that bet. Decidedly fewer than half of the class would take that bet, and the likelihood of that should be 50%. Let's move on. The employee involvement model is a model of participative management. Because managers make decisions, smart managers know when to involve others in those decisions. This model answers the question of how and when should we involve people in our decision making. The goal of giving others input on a decision is that often there is a better problem identification. Sometimes we think a problem is one thing, but when others get involved, we find out that the problem is actually something else. Of course, the old adage that two heads are better than one is an outcome of decision making that we desire. We want more and better solutions to be offered. Because of the aforementioned decision heuristics, when one person is tasked with making a decision, sometimes only one or two solutions will come to mind. But when we involve others in that decision, solutions may arise that we alone would have never thought of. Well, when we involve others in decisions, as with two heads are better than one, the greater the number of solutions, the higher the likelihood that we choose the best solution. Now, as with all management issues, the likelihood of positive outcomes from employee involvement depends upon several contingencies. The contingencies moderate the relationship between X and Y. They moderate the relationship between employee involvement and decision outcomes. Essentially, you can use this phrase: the contingencies fill in the blank that says X leads to Y, especially if the decision is non-programmed, then we want more people involved because the decision is extraordinary, unusual, or highly important. We also involve more people when the leader simply lacks the experience or knowledge to do so by themselves. Leaders cannot know everything. That's why they surround themselves with competent subordinates. The person running the nuclear power generator does not have to be a nuclear physicist. They hire nuclear physicists to help them make important decisions. We want to involve others in the decision when we need everyone to buy into the decision. For example, sometimes we involve employees to create psychological ownership of the decision. By creating psychological ownership, we minimize any future attempts at casting blame elsewhere if the decision turns out to be a bad one. We also involve employees in decisions only when conflict level is low in the group. When the conflict level is high, involving the group in the decision can be very problematic for obvious reasons. Teams in times of strife tend to be less than effective in many decisions. Let's move on. Some decisions are best made with input from others, but from who and why and even when? That is a tough one. We have to determine if we alone make the decision or if we let employees make the decision without us, and all points in between. Some important aspects of determining if the decision should be made solo or via some group method include the decision quality. This requirement is one such factor. If the decision quality requirement is low, then the decision is sometimes best made alone. If the decision quality requirement is high, then it might be better to involve others. As mentioned, if the leader lacks sufficient information or expertise, then it probably should be a group decision. Similarly, if the subordinate or subordinates have sufficient information, then it might be best to involve them. If they lack such information, then it's probably best to make a solo decision. The goal congruence of the decision between the leader and the subordinates plays an important role. For example, the leader may want to increase customer satisfaction by making employees more easily identifiable via a company uniform. The subordinates may adamantly oppose the wearing of uniforms. Their goals in this example would be incongruent with the leader. That is a critical issue. If the subordinates' goals are lined up with the leader, then the problem is easily solved by all. But if the group congruency is off, then maybe the leader should make the decision alone. Getting buy-in can be critical at this juncture. Of course, the structure of the problem is another thing to consider. If it's a program decision, then the corporate manual dictates the solution, and you don't need a team of 8 to read the manual. The leader makes the decision alone when it is programmed, but involves others when it is non-programmed. Let's move on. Here we see the different scenarios where subordinates are allowed to play some role in decision making. This is called normative decision theory. And after examining all of the various options on who gets a say in the decision and who does not, we'll map it all out. But first, let's look at the different scenarios where managers allow input ranging from none to everyone. In the autocratic decision, there are two subtypes. The first is A1, where no input is gathered from the subordinate team. The other is A2, where there is an announcement to the team that a problem exists, but the leader will solve it alone. So A1, no announcement, suddenly the leader springs on the subordinates. There was a problem and here's the solution I have chosen without your input. A2, the problem is announced and the leader announces the solution later. The next type of decision is called consultative, and it is in two subtypes also. The first is C1, where you consult with the team one-on-one to get their input, but you make the decision yourself. Others give input in one-on-one with you. The other is C2, where you consult with the team in a team meeting, all hands on deck. You ask for suggestions, but you make the decision yourself. Subordinates tend to appreciate the two consultative decision scenarios over the autocratic ones. If the consultative scenarios, the leader gets information from others. Sometimes it's good info, and sometimes it's bad info. The last scenario is a group decision where the leader puts the problem up for input in a group meeting. The group makes the decision and the leader simply moderates the meeting in a facilitative role. The downside of this is that everyone in the group must agree with the group decision. This can be a suboptimal decision, as sometimes it's a watered down solution if you have to achieve consensus. It's called G2 for some unknown reason. There probably is a G1 solution, but I am not aware of it. Let's move on. Here is the normative decision model. Okay, I know it looks like a crazy ball of hair. We're going to walk through this. You'll make sense of it. Let's go back to the issue of requiring employees to wear uniforms at work, and if so, what should they look like? Each square in this map is a node in the path to the best decision style. So let's restate the problem. The problem is that customers in our retail store complain about not being able to find a retail clerk to help them. The company allows employees to wear their own clothes to work, within reason, of course. Then they pin a very tiny name badge or shirt, but customers cannot always see the badge, especially from a distance. Because customer satisfaction is down, so are sales. This problem has serious financial aspects. The first node is the QR, quality requirement node. We ask the question of ourselves, how important is the technical quality of the decision? The answer is that the quality of the decision is high, because if sales continue downward in a spiral, the company may have to lay off employees. The next node is the CR, or commitment requirement node. We ask, how important is employee commitment to the decision? The answer is highly important. It is the employees who have to wear the uniforms, not the owner. And if the employees are not committed to it, some of them may quit. The next node is the LI, Leaders Information Node. We ask here, does the leader have sufficient information to make a high quality decision? In this case, suppose the answer is no. The leader has never worn a uniform to work and would not know what style to implement. The leader is clueless about employee uniforms. The next node is the ST, or problem structure node. Here we ask, is the problem well structured? Let's say it's not well structured because it is unprogrammed, because the company has never faced a decision like this. There is no if-then scenario in the employee handbook on this issue. Now we're at the next node, the CP node, CP for commitment probability. Here the issue is that if the leader makes the decision alone, will the subordinates be committed to the decision? Very few people like having a dress code thrown on them. If they are not committed, then various twists on the uniform may arise as people skirt the rule to see how far they can push the uniform requirement. The next node is the GC, or goal congruence node. At this node, the question is, do employees share the organizational goals to be attained in solving this problem? Let's suppose the answer is yes, because they are aware that sales have been declining and that they and the store have been getting negative online reviews. They don't want to lose their jobs, and the leader does not want to lay any of them off. Their goals are congruent with each other. Now we're at the SI node, subordinate information. It asks employees, do employees have enough information to make a high quality decision? Let's suppose that the employees are aware that sales are down and some of them might get laid off if they don't improve. So yes. Furthermore, many of them have had jobs that required uniforms, so they indeed have high levels of subordinate information. This suggests that the G2 style should be used. The leader should facilitate a meeting of all employees and let the employees decide the policy. And if they decide to wear uniforms, then they can decide what sort of uniform to wear. Some may want to dress like Hooters waitresses, and others may want to dress like military officers. The uniform on which they decide will likely be somewhere in the middle of those two extremes. Now you'll note in this route, the CO, or subordinate conflict node, was bypassed. At that node, we would have asked if conflict among the employees over the preferred solution would be likely. But we didn't have to do that in this made-up on-the-fly scenario. Sometimes you will. Let's move on. There are some common characteristics that many, if not most, creative people share. They tend to be slightly smarter than the rest of us. They never give up. As Edison said, genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. They tend to know a lot about the topic or area in which they are working. Edison knew a lot about electricity and electric devices. It's only logical that he developed the light bulb and the phonograph. They also tend to be quite imaginative, often way outside of what others would imagine. This imagination is comprised of several traits and dispositions. The first is openness to experience. That's a big 5 trait that suggests that they are broad-minded, inquisitive, and have a need for stimulation. They tend to be comfortable when they're alone, so they have a moderately low need for affiliation. One need only think of the lonely artist toiling away in their studio to picture this. They are highly self-directed. Creativity comes from within, not from without or outside us. It's an internal thing, and channeling that self-direction into a productive capacity is very important. They also value stimulation. That's part of openness to experience as well. Musicians love music. Painters love color. Architects love buildings. Seeing or experiencing those things is what drives them, motivates, and stimulates them. Let's move on. In order to foster creativity in the workplace, companies try and leverage several things within their control. They establish a learning orientation in which mistakes are not such a big deal. Some firms will even require a large number of new ideas, knowing full well that only some of them will be successful. 3M, for example, requires its R&D scientists and engineers to dream up as many new products as they can. If some of them are harebrained and silly, well, so be it. Other companies make use of 20% time, where employees are allowed to work on whatever they want for 20% of their work week, as long as they produce something, anything. That is, they can do what they want, but they must produce something potentially of value. Sometimes managers just try and design jobs and contribute to workplaces that are intrinsically motivating. To do this, they let employees know how what they do contributes to the larger success of the firm or even to the success of society in general. That is, they emphasize the significance of their tasks. They also give employees autonomy on how they do their job. Few people like having someone look over their shoulder, so to speak. When we allow employees to decide how they perform the essential duties of the job, as long as the job gets done, then this level of autonomy contributes to their intrinsic motivation. Now, recall that intrinsic motivation is the motivation to engage in behavior for the sake of the enjoyment of the behavior and how it makes us feel about us. Other companies simply offer ample resources to get the job done. When we have the latest, greatest tools to do the job, we can be more creative. It might seem a bit silly, but if a carpenter only has a hammer, then what they make will be fairly inelegant. If they have a saw, a plane, a level, etc., they can usually make something more beautiful and more effective. Of course, it should go without saying that if the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing, then both hands cannot operate very effectively. So firms have to foster open communication. In order to do our jobs creatively, we can usually benefit by swapping ideas with others who are doing similar jobs. Let's move on. Besides fostering a creative workplace with policies, procedures, and cultural manifestations, companies also sometimes have explicitly creative activities. There are a lot of different behaviors that employees can engage in to be more creative. Sometimes it's as simple as taking a different look at the problem. By redefining a problem, we look at it from a different angle. To do this, we can look back at different projects that we've set aside, and we can simply explore the issue with other coworkers. For example, some college professors keep a folder of research ideas and projects that they hope to do someday. Occasionally, they will open the folder and take a look at a problem that they've set aside, and sometimes they'll even talk about the project with colleagues who do similar research. More structured activities include forms of associative play, where we try and get people to go on a tangent or build upon an idea offered by someone else. For example, creativity can be storytelling, like sitting around a campfire and everyone telling one tidbit of a scary story of their own design, followed by the next person picking up the story where the first person left off. Sometimes we encourage employees to give poetry readings and art exhibits just to get their creative juices flowing. We also sometimes use morphological analysis, which makes use of every possible permutation of product characteristics. Some are ridiculous, but some would be good. For example, think of a food product manufacturer who makes food in 3 flavors, with 3 textures, and in 3 containers. So there's 27 permutations. The flavors might be chicken, strawberry, and vanilla. The textures might be ice cream, gum, and soup. The containers might be a test tube, a milk carton, and a jug. So of the 27 possible permutations, the morphological analysis can be conducted. Now, chicken-flavored ice cream in a test tube would be sort of bad, but we all know that vanilla-flavored ice cream in a carton is definitely good. Other creative activities include various types of cross-pollination, which involves taking different perspectives on the same problem. We can do this by using cross-functional or diverse teams, like adding a finance person to the marketing team simply to get another perspective. We also have internal information exchange sessions where employees give reports on their latest ideas and projects. These are often required with the 20% time policies where companies let employees work on whatever they want to for 20% of their time. The only caveat is that they must present their work to the other employees. Other firms use a sort of internal trade show where employees man booths and tables, and other employees walk around and discuss ideas and projects with them. Both associative play and cross-pollination are not informal, and they require some organizational support. Simply redefining the problem can be done alone and without formal organizational support. Let's move on. Here are some tips for business practitioners. It is critical that we hire people who are smarter and more creative than us. If our ego gets in the way of hiring the best, then the company is not likely to realize its true potential. Let people have a say in most decisions. That builds psychological ownership where they cannot disavow the decision if it does not go well. Also, they're more inclined to work hard on the decision because they made the decision themselves. If we let our perception of the situation get in the way of effective decision making, then we are prone to falling prey to restrictive mental models and suboptimal decisions. Perception is not always reality, but it does guide our behavior. Please remember that there is really no such thing as misperception. It is simply a different perception, which might be a view of something altogether different than what we want it to be. Sometimes we simply do not have the time nor the money to make perfectly rational choices. That's sometimes, okay, because our competitors are usually constrained by the same thing. To mix 2 adages from the Old West, sometimes you just have to pull the trigger and hope that you don't shoot yourself in the foot. Hire creative people and value their creativity, even if that creativity is not needed right away. Rarely is creativity a bad thing. Someday it might be critical to the company's survival, and you will be glad that you have someone who is capable of creative solution making. You can bank on that. Let's move on. Well, thanks. That's all for now.